Hello, sophomores. This is Mrs. Patumpa with your notes for the end of Unit 1. These will be the notes that you need to finish up that unit while I am out of school on the March for Life. So make sure that you have your notes packet out while you're watching this so that you can write down all the material that you need as you go along. One of my classes, I'm not sure which one, I think sixth period, did not get this last slide about grace on the last day that I taught in class. So if you are one of those students who missed this slide, you might want to just pause it really quick and make sure that you have this material written down. Okay, so the topic that you really need to learn about for my class is conscience. Conscience is really a key concept in Christian morality, a very important concept. It comes from Latin, with knowledge, just like in Spanish, con means with, and science comes from the Latin word for knowledge. So one of the things we have to understand, first of all, conscience has to do with knowing, and it's really more of an action rather than a thing, although it's an action, a mental action, if that makes sense. Conscience was actually used before Christian theologians kind of took the idea and made it our own. In the original meaning of conscience in Roman society, the philosophers talked about this idea of a kind of an imaginary bystander who could see everything that you did, and then afterward that person would then sort of remind you of what you had been up to. They were conscious, if you will. They were aware of all the things that you had done, and then would sort of maybe tug at your heartstrings and make you feel guilty or feel good after you had acted, if you had done well or done poorly, depending. Now, today in the Christian church, we talk about conscience in a way that's a little different from that. So we're going to need to talk about, first of all, what conscience is not, and then we'll talk about what conscience is. So, I guess I'm going to say conscience is not just, because these things are a part of conscience, but if this is the only way that you define conscience, you're probably misunderstanding it. So one of the more common misunderstandings of conscience is that it is an inner voice. That, like Jiminy Cricket character from the Disney movie Pinocchio, he sings that famous song in the movie Pinocchio, "Let your conscience be your guide." And Jiminy Cricket in the movie Pinocchio kind of represents this little separate character who is the voice of Pinocchio's conscience. The problem with that is that it kind of personifies conscience and makes it seem like conscience is something that's separate from us, that it's like a different creature from us. Our conscience is completely a part of who we are, but it is able to sort of detach itself from our subjective motivations, like the things that, the feelings and the things we want, and to kind of take a step away from that and help us to look at our choices and our actions from a more objective perspective. One of the things that people think conscience is that it's the same thing. It's just like the way we were raised or our upbringing. The problem with that is that our parents, unfortunately, the reality is that our parents are not necessarily always right. So we can't always count on our upbringing or the way that we were raised to tell us right from wrong. And last but not least, a lot of people think of conscience as a feeling. We'll often talk about conscience, for example, as a guilty conscience, right? And that's about feeling guilty. Or sometimes people will talk about conscience as just like a gut instinct, like go with your gut. And that's what they think their conscience is. Conscience is not a feeling. It's not our gut, because those things can be wrong, especially our feelings. You could, for example, cause a car accident. You could hit a patch of black ice. You could slide through an intersection and you could cause a car accident, and you might feel terrible about that. But that doesn't mean that what you did was a sin. You can feel bad about things even when you don't sin. So if it's not those things, or it's not just those things, there's a part of our conscience that is developed by the way that we were raised, where our conscience is informed by our feelings, but that's not what it is. Conscience is the act of applying knowledge to conduct. In other words, what the church would define it as a practical judgment of reason that helps a person decide the goodness or sinfulness of an action or attitude. St. Bonaventure, who teaches about conscience quite a bit, says that everybody's born with a conscience. That's what it means to say that it's partly innate, but we have to develop it. We have to learn, we have to study, we have to pray. So the idea of applying knowledge to conduct means that we take the knowledge that we have developed and gathered over years, the experiences that we've had, learning from the church, learning from other people, and then we take all that knowledge and that wisdom and we use that to apply that to our conduct to decide whether or not something is right or wrong. Sometimes we'll apply that knowledge after we've already acted, and that's called consequent conscience. It comes from the same word as consequences, right? Consequences happen after you've done something wrong, but we don't really want to think about what we did after we did it. We would rather, of course, think about it before we acted. So that's called antecedent conscience, and obviously that's preferable. We want to think before we act. Ante means before, right? So that's the better idea, is to think about your choice before you do it and decide whether or not it's right or wrong, which then will give you the ability, obviously, to choose not to do it if it's wrong. Conscience really goes through 3 steps, right, or 3 aspects. So the first thing is being aware that we need to make a decision. That's pretty obvious, right? The opposite of awareness, of course, is a lax conscience. Lax comes from the same word as lazy, not referring to the sport. Sometimes we'll talk about lacrosse. We shorten it to say lax. The word lax means lazy. So a lax conscience is one that is ignored or underused. You're lazy and choose not to be aware that you need to do something. Development means taking an action to develop your conscience. That is to inform your conscience. So we want to have an informed conscience. We don't want to have a lax conscience. We have to educate ourselves. We have to develop it. If you're making a choice about whether or not to take somebody that you love off of life support in a hospital, you're not going to just do that without educating yourself. You're going to ask questions. You're going to pray. You're going to talk to doctors. You're going to ask for a second opinion. You're going to inform yourself. That's having an informed conscience. And we should do that with all of our moral decisions, is try to have an informed conscience, not just big decisions like taking somebody off of life support. And then, of course, our last step or aspect of conscience is to actually decide. Sometimes it is possible to choose wrongly. Even though you may believe that in good conscience what you're doing is correct, it is possible to have an error of conscience. Usually that's because we maybe don't know everything. Maybe there's some information that we were not aware of. And so even though we thought we were doing the right thing, maybe we weren't. That's called an erroneous conscience. One of the teachings of the church that is very important is the primacy of conscience. The primacy of conscience means that when we inform our conscience, when we educate our conscience, when we develop our conscience, if we truly believe that what we are doing is the right thing, then we have to obey our conscience. As the Catechism says, deep within his conscience, man discovers a law which he has not laid upon himself, but which he must obey. And then it continues and goes on to say, man has the right to act in conscience and in freedom, so as personally to make moral decisions. He must not be forced to act contrary to his conscience, nor must he be prevented from acting according to his conscience, especially in religious matters. This is where we talk about things like war and killing in war. And they talk about conscientious objectors. They're talking about this kind of idea that if you believe killing is wrong, if your conscience tells you that you cannot kill, then the government or the military should never force you to act contrary to your conscience. We should always obey our conscience. In other words, what that means is that once we have informed and educated ourselves, and we can't just, again, this is not just a feeling or going with our gut instinct. We're not just doing what we want to do, what's convenient or easy. But if we truly inform ourselves, educate ourselves, pray, and go through all the steps needed to have an informed conscience, and we come to a decision, then the church would say we are required to follow it, even when it contradicts the opinions of others. Even if it contradicted Mrs. Potampa's opinion about a moral decision, even if it contradicted your priest's opinion about a moral decision, even if it contradicted, dare I say it, the Pope's opinion about your moral decision, the church says that your conscience is primary and you have to follow it. Gandhi said, even though Gandhi wasn't Catholic, this I think kind of gets to the point. He says there is a higher court than the courts of justice, and that is the court of conscience. It supersedes all other courts. So when somebody like Rosa Parks refuses to move to the back of the bus, that was a decision of conscience. The church would say, even if you're breaking the law like Rosa Parks was, if you truly believe in good conscience that your action is the right action, then we have to follow our conscience. Last but not least, Pope John Paul II published an encyclical called Veritatis Splendor in 1993 that talks a lot about conscience. The English translation of that title, by the way, is The Splendor of Truth. He talks about our conscience as doing what Jesus wants us to do. So this idea that conscience is really cannot be understood apart from the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the church about Jesus. So we have to educate ourselves using the teachings of Jesus and the church. Otherwise, we can't really say that we have an informed conscience. So I hope that gives you a pretty good summary of the idea of conscience. If you have questions or concerns, I will be back in school on Tuesday. And then we will take a test over this unit on the block day. So make sure that you have all the notes and that you are ready to go for that test on the block day. Have a great weekend, everybody.